I'm raising 2 girls on my own after my wife died, and I keep things simple because I don't have room for chaos. One of the most important ones is that there are no games about spirits, no trying to contact the dead. I explained it clearly without trying to scare them because I wanted them to listen, not panic. They always said they understood, and they looked serious when they said it, which is why I let my guard down more than I should have. That night felt normal at first, with both of them in their room and me finishing some work while listening to the house the way I always do. The silence lasted too long for a house with kids, but I ignored it, thinking they were just tired or focused on something quiet. Suddenly, someone knocked on my door, and when I opened it, both of them were standing too close together, holding on to each other. They looked so tense. "We need help." I followed them to their room without asking questions right away. The lights were on, the curtains were closed, and there was a sweet smell that didn't belong there, like something from the kitchen had been used and left out. On the floor, I saw the letters drawn in a circle and the cup placed over them, and I felt immediate frustration because I had always warned them about this. "I told you not to do this." Instead of defending themselves, one of them looked at the cup and spoke in a low voice. "Someone answered, but it wasn't Mom." They both looked toward the door at the same time, and neither of them smiled or tried to turn it into a joke. I stayed still for a moment, watching how they reacted instead of focusing on the game. They weren't trying to convince me of anything. They were waiting for something to happen again. Then we heard a voice from the hallway, low and clear, calling one of their names like someone standing just outside the room. It didn't drag the word or whispered. It said it in a normal tone that made it feel closer. I walked out right away and checked both sides of the hallway. There was no one there, and nothing looked out of place. When I came back, both of them were on the bed, sitting close together. "It does that when we stop." I told them it was probably something from outside or sound they misunderstood. I turned to leave, but one of them pointed at the wall without speaking, and I followed her hand slowly because she didn't lower her arm. The message wasn't there before. "Come back." The letters were thick and uneven, and when I touched them, I realized it was ketchup, which made me turn back to them with frustration because it looked like a joke taken too far. "You don't do this and then act scared." They both started at once, trying to explain they didn't write it, and their voices were breaking in a way that didn't match a prank. But I still wasn't ready to accept that. Later that night, I stayed awake with my door open, listening for anything that didn't belong, because even if I didn't believe them fully, I couldn't ignore what I had heard. The house stayed quiet for a long time, and then I heard steps in the hallway. The sound had weight behind it, and it moved in a controlled way that didn't match how my daughters walk. I stepped outside and followed the direction of the sound, and it stopped right outside their door, like whoever was there knew I was coming. I stood in front of their door listening, and there was no movement inside, not even the sound of shifting on the bed. The silence stretched long enough to make me hesitate before opening it. When I did, both of them were asleep, and I checked them closely to make sure they were not pretending. Their breathing was slow, and neither of them reacted when I got close. Then I looked at the wall again. "This time, stay." The message had changed, and I knew it wasn't there before because I had already seen the previous one clearly. I woke them up and asked who wrote it, and they both looked confused and scared in a way that didn't feel staged. One of them started crying quietly while the other kept shaking her head. "We didn't get up." I checked their hands and the floor, and there was nothing showing that they had moved recently, and that forced me to stop assuming and start paying attention. In the hallway, I noticed a small red mark on the floor near the door, and when I crouched down, I saw that it matched the color on the wall. It wasn't a spill. It looked like something had been touched and lifted. I followed the marks slowly, keeping my eyes on the floor, and they led away from their bedroom toward mine. I moved carefully, not rushing, because the pattern was clear enough to follow, and the marks stopped at my door. When I opened it, I already knew something would be there. "Marry me." The message was larger this time, and it didn't match anything my daughters could write, which made it clear that something else was involved. I stayed in the room trying to understand how someone could move through the house without being seen, and I went through every possible explanation I could think of, but none of them worked. Then I heard a small movement behind me. I turned slowly and saw him standing in the corner. He was thin, older, wearing my wife's dress in a way that didn't fit his body, and he held an axe in both hands. His face was calm like he had been waiting. She didn't answer, so I did. I stepped back, keeping distance between us, and tried to position myself closer to the door. "Leave now." He smiled slightly and adjusted his grip on the axe. "They asked for someone, and I stayed." He moved forward and raised the axe.
You can't hide forever!
I pushed past him, hitting his arm to throw off the swing. The blade struck the wall behind me with a heavy sound that carried through the house. I ran into the hallway and called for my daughters, not trying to stay quiet anymore. I heard him coming behind me, faster now, and I reached their room and opened the door. One of them was gone. The other pointed toward the hallway. He took her. I grabbed her arm and pulled her with me. He approached at the end of the hallway holding my other daughter by the arm, and she wasn't fighting him. She was looking at him like she knew him. She wanted me to stay. Then he turned and ran. I chased him through the house, following the sounds of his footsteps as he moved toward the back. He reached the wall near the storage area and pressed against it. And a hidden panel opened. He went inside with her, and I reached it seconds later, forcing it open with both hands. The space behind it was narrow and dark, and the air smelled like someone had been there for a long time. The passage opened into a small hidden room filled with things taken from the house, including food, clothes, and objects that had gone missing. There was another exit, and it was open. I called the police and explained everything as clearly as I could. They arrived quickly and searched the house, the walls, and the area around it. They found signs that he had been living inside the structure for weeks. They identified him as Daniel LaPlante. They found my daughter later that night, sitting outside a store, eating ice cream, while he stayed nearby talking to her like nothing had happened. She didn't look scared. They arrested him without resistance. He's in prison now, and they told me about other cases connected to him, about houses he entered and people he watched before acting. They explained his behavior, but it didn't change what happened in my house. My daughter still talks about him sometimes, and the way she describes him doesn't match what I saw. Because she says he was patient and that he listened to her when she spoke. That part is what stays with me, because it means he wasn't just hiding. He was building trust over time. Daniel LaPlante was known for a series of disturbing crimes in the 1980s that combined stalking, home invasion, and psychological manipulation. As a teenager, he secretly lived inside the walls of a family's house, watching them for weeks and moving through hidden spaces without being detected. He used this access to intimidate and control his victims, creating fear through strange messages and appearances. I've been a video game developer for more than 40 years now. I've worked on hundreds of titles and collaborated with thousands of people across this industry. Over time, I learned something from each of them, lessons that shaped and refined my craft. However, there is one developer I worked with early in my career who still haunts me. Even after all these years, I still can't forget what happened during the development of one particular project. Drowned God. I'd been brought on as a junior programmer at Epic Multimedia Group through a referral from my college professor. We were developing a game called Drowned God, which would later be published by Inkscape. For those unfamiliar with Drowned God, it was a puzzle-driven first-person point-and-click CD-ROM adventure game released for PC in 1996. The game was titled Drowned God, a name that alluded to a submerged ancient power which had been lost to time after it had been buried beneath memory and history. This idea shaped the game's entire premise, and the theme heavily inspired how we structured the gameplay. At its core, the game revolved around uncovering suppressed knowledge about conspiracy theories, occult secrets, esoteric symbolism, and humanity's origins. The game was built like a research labyrinth as the story unfolded through exploration and puzzle solving. Players investigated hidden documents, fragmented texts, and symbolic imagery tied to alternative archaeology, occult traditions, sacred geometry, alchemy, and Atlantis mythology. It was niche, strange, and unlike anything else being made at the time. I was also excited to work on the game's ambitious story, which starts out as a simple search for truth before spiraling into a layered conspiracy involving hidden bloodlines, Knights Templar, secret societies, and ancient advanced civilizations. I was one of the few junior developers on the team during the game's development. My job was to assist with engine adjustments, asset integration, puzzle scripting logic, navigation nodes, and trigger events. I was still a wide-eyed newbie at the time, and I remember trying to do my best on the tasks I was assigned while learning as much as I could. As the game's development continued, I grew closer to the team. There were about 86 people working on the game at the time. And while I enjoyed working with every single one of them, there was one person on the team who always felt out of place. His name was Neville Reed, and I will never forget the day I first met him. Neville was a research consultant specializing in conspiracy theories, esoteric symbolism, and occult studies. He'd been brought in to provide research support for the game's esoteric themes, expand upon the conspiracy framework, and ensure thematic consistency. Neville was also a narrative consultant with a programming background, so he was fully integrated into the team as a consultant and developer. I'd never met anyone like him before, and I could already tell there was something different about the new developer. Over the course of the game's development, Neville fleshed out the script's conspiracy theories as well as the game's esoteric and occult themes. He also used his extensive knowledge to provide authentic symbolic references, and he ensured internal consistency in the game's myth structures. I'd initially admired his work ethic and dedication to the game's thematic cohesion, but I eventually became horrified by the morbid lengths he went to deepen the symbolic and occult elements in the game. Neville would often make these strange statements about how every developer working on the game had been given a great task by the Old One. He also told me on several occasions that the Old One spoke to him every day, telling him to spread his message through this video game. I was confused at first, as I had no idea who this Old One was or what he was talking about. But Neville was convinced that the Old One was guiding our hands as we wrote the game's code. It was at this point that I realized that Neville wasn't just a consultant who studied the occult and was familiar with niche conspiracy theories. He was actually a full-blown occultist and conspiracy fanatic who believed we were all making this game by the will of an ancient being. Things only got worse from there as Neville began to put up these disturbing occult items on his desk and around the office. I can still remember how alarmed I was when I saw what it looked like an infant's skull sitting next to his PC on his desk. Neville had claimed that the skull belonged to the Old One's infant son, and he brought it there after the Old One had told him to. He also had these rotting human teeth he had scattered around his desk, which he said belonged to the Old One's mother. He even tried offering them to me, urging me to put them on my desk while I wrote gameplay scripts. I began to avoid Neville, as even though I'd never believed in the occult, I found these items and his behavior extremely disturbing. Things only got worse from there, as in addition to these grotesque items he would bring, I watched Neville cut open his palm with a knife and pour his blood around his keyboard. It really seemed like I was the only one on the team who noticed Neville's strange behaviors, and while I was extremely uncomfortable with it, I couldn't really complain as a junior developer. I told myself that I would just ignore his unusual antics and distance myself from him. But unfortunately, that didn't work, as Neville had now taken a weird interest in me. He would follow me around the office, asking me if I was free after work and if I would like to join his organization and their mission. I always politely declined as I told him I was only interested in making games and my career as a developer, but he was incessant. It didn't matter how many times I declined his invitation, Neville wasn't taking no for an answer. Things got so bad that I caught him following me home, so I decided to confront him. I told him that if he didn't leave me alone, I would go to the police and tell them that he had been harassing and stalking me. I also told him that the only reason I hadn't said anything at work was that I was a junior developer and I didn't want to cause any trouble during my first job, but I assured him that I would tell everyone if his harassment didn't stop. My threats to go to the police and tell the other developers what he'd been doing had worked, and Neville left me alone for some time. However, while I thought the bizarre situation with Neville was finally over, the worst was yet to come. During the weeks leading up to the game's release, I would spend late nights at work going over a few final details for the game's release. However, on one of these late nights, I heard strange noises from outside at around 1 a.m. Everyone had gone home and I was the only one left, so I was startled by the noises and went to check them out. I could feel my heart racing in my chest as 7 hooded figures were now outside. They were surrounding an unreleased copy of Drowned God, muttering words in a language I didn't understand. After a couple of minutes, one of the hooded individuals took off his hood and my heart dropped to my stomach as I recognized Neville. He gestured to his right as he uttered the words, "It's time." And 2 of the hooded individuals went to a nearby truck and brought out a struggling ram. They brought the animal to the circle and Neville revealed a knife. I could hear the ram's muffled screams as they put a muzzle on its mouth to silence its cries. With no hesitation, Neville slit the ram's throat over the CD, and they praised the old one as the animal bled out, dying on the floor. Then they dipped their fingers into the animal's neck and rubbed the blood on their faces as they thanked the old one. I felt like I was frozen in place, as even though I wanted to run, my feet stayed motionless. Once the ram stopped moving, Neville raised his hand and said, "Save your praises, brothers. There is still one more sacrifice for tonight." He then took a long pause before revealing what the second sacrifice was saying. "The old one has asked for young blood, so just like the ram that served as an appetizer for God, we must also slit the throat of a young man whom I've asked to join our ranks. He refused and even went as far as to threaten me. This man has spat on the gift I offered, and he must understand what that means. I've been monitoring his movements in secret, and I know he's been working late for the past week. So we bring him here, slit his throat over the ram for the ritual to be complete. Do not hesitate, brothers, for tonight the old one will drink the blood he craves, and he will know the taste of a developer's passion." I can't find the words to describe the fear I was gripped by in that instant, and I felt like my adrenaline kicked in as I ran for my life. Neville had noticed me bolting, and I heard him scream, "Stop!" But I didn't. I ran as far as my legs could carry me. I didn't stop until I reached my house and locked my doors. My heart was still racing in my chest, and I couldn't sleep that night. Even though I was terrified, I told myself that this was the final straw, and I planned on going to the police after I told the other developers what Neville had planned on doing. However, when I got to work the next day, Neville was gone. There were also no traces of the gruesome rituals he'd carried out the night before, and I didn't even see a single drop of blood from where the ram had bled out. It was at this point that I felt like I was losing my mind, as I wondered if what I saw actually happened or if I'd hallucinated the whole thing. I knew I couldn't go to the authorities without any evidence, and with Neville gone, it was my word against his. I felt so defeated that I asked to leave the team before the game's launch, and it took me a while before I began developing again. I've kept what happened that night to myself for most of my life, and I felt it was fitting to anonymously share what happened online now that I'm nearing retirement. It was an experience that marred my first job as a developer, and even though I'd worked so hard on the game, I never played Drowned God because, even though it sounded silly, I was convinced the game had been cursed. Over the years, I've made several attempts to get some closure, and I once tried to look into Neville and find out where he was. However, it seemed like Neville Reed had vanished off the face of the earth. He wasn't even listed in the game's credits. I attempted to trace his family so I could ask about his current whereabouts, but my search led to several dead ends. I tried to put the whole thing in the past after I couldn't find Neville, and I told myself that time would eventually give me some form of closure. However, I keep having these terrifying thoughts that the man named Neville Reed wasn't actually a person, and I somehow worked with a developer who never even existed. In 1996, point-and-click PC game Drowned God, developed by the now-defunct Epic Multimedia Group and published by Inkscape, remains one of the strangest releases of the mid-90s CD-ROM era. Drowned God was considered to be a niche and obscure title after its release, but it began to gain attention after the game was linked to several unsettling incidents. One of these incidents was shared by an anonymous developer who claimed to have worked on the game and witnessed occultic rituals during the game's development. There was also a widespread notion that the video game was cursed after a small number of anonymous players reported feeling nauseous, passing out, or going into shock after loading up the game. Despite the many disturbing reports that were associated with Drowned God, none of these incidents have ever been confirmed. It's been extremely difficult to confirm any of these reports, as they still remain anonymous, leading many to believe that these incidents are all bogus or fictional. There were also no prevalent reports of players going into shock or passing out after the game's release in 1996. The game's creator, Richard Horne, who is often referred to by his pen name Harry Horse, brought Drowned God to life with the game's co-creator, Alistair Graham, and there were no confirmed reports of any programmers performing occultic rituals during the game's development. Furthermore, there were also no records of a consultant with a programming background among the remaining 83 individuals who worked on the game in the mid-90s. However, there is still a majority of people who believed Drowned God is a cursed video game. While most of these theories have remained speculative, there are several gamers who are convinced that the horrific 2007 tragedy, where the game's creator, Richard Horne, brutally murdered his wife before committing suicide, is connected to the supposed occultic rituals that were revealed in the anonymous developer's story. Several investigations into these claims revealed that there is no proof that someone carried out these occultic rituals in 1996. However, despite the lack of conclusive evidence, some people remain convinced that Drowned God is one of the many cursed video games in circulation, causing terror to any unfortunate individual who decides to play the game.
The messages started after she was already dead, and I didn't know it. I had been seeing her for a short time, and everything moved fast, and I didn't mind that, until she started talking about moving in together like it was already decided. I told her no in a calm way, and I didn't leave room for confusion because I knew what I wanted and what I didn't. She didn't argue when I said it, but instead she just looked at me for a few seconds like she was holding something back. Then she grabbed her things and left without raising her voice, and that silence stayed with me longer than any argument would have. I told myself it was over, and I went back to my normal routine without expecting to hear from her again. 2 weeks later, my phone lit up with a message that didn't sound like her, and that's when everything started to go wrong. The first message didn't try to explain anything, and it didn't ask for a response, since it went straight to a threat that felt too specific to ignore. I want to see you on the ground, bleeding. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, trying to match that tone with the person I knew, and it didn't fit, no matter how I looked at it. I called her once, but the call didn't go through, so I sent a short message asking what was going on, but I didn't get an answer. Instead, I got more threats that came faster and with more detail. If I ever see you again, I will use a knife. I stopped replying after that, and I changed my number after a few days because I wanted it to end. The problem was that it didn't end, since the messages started again on the new number in less than 2 days. I had just started seeing a new girl. She showed me her phone one night, and when I read the messages she had received, I felt something shift because they were written the same way, and they mentioned things that me and my ex had done together that no one else should have known. The messages became more detailed over time, and they started to describe parts of my day that were too specific to ignore. They mentioned places I had been and things I had done only hours before. You stopped at the gas station, and you looked behind you twice before getting in the car. I didn't go to the police because I kept thinking things would calm down if I reached her directly, and I didn't want to involve anyone else because she had a small child and I didn't want to make things worse for him. That decision started to feel like a mistake. That night I stayed home and kept things quiet, but the silence didn't help. It made every small sound stand out more than usual, and I found myself focusing on the back of the house without knowing why. My phone was on the table, and I kept looking at it without touching it because I was expecting another message, even though I didn't want to read it. There was a stretch of time where nothing happened, and that made it worse, because it gave me space to think about what could happen next. Then, the handle on the back door moved slowly, and I saw it turn without making a sound. I stood up and moved toward the kitchen because it was the only place where I could grab something useful, and I kept my steps steady, even though my breathing felt tighter than usual. The door opened, and a person dressed in black stepped inside with their face covered, moving forward without hesitation like they already knew the layout. I was sure it was my ex. Then I saw the light behind her, and it wasn't coming from outside. She had started a fire. The heat built quickly, and the smell of smoke spread through the room in a way that made it harder to focus. But I knew I couldn't stand still, because the person in front of me was already moving toward me with clear intention. I stepped back and kept my distance while watching her hands, expecting them to reach for something that could end it quickly. There was a brief pause where neither of us moved, and that pause stretched long enough to make me understand that I was alone in that moment, and that no one was coming to help me. She moved forward suddenly, and I reacted by pushing her back instead of trying to run, since the fire had already started to block the way out. We collided near the table, and something fell to the floor with a sharp sound that made everything feel louder and more chaotic. She grabbed my shirt and tried to pull me down, and I resisted by shifting my weight and pushing against her, even though I could feel my strength dropping faster than I expected. I managed to hit her hard enough to make her step back, and that gave me a second to pull away and create space. There was another moment where everything slowed down, and I could hear the fire spreading behind us while the smoke got thicker and harder to ignore. She reached toward my neck, and I reacted by grabbing her hood and pulling it back with force because I needed to see who I was dealing with. The hood came off, and the face underneath didn't match anything I expected. It wasn't her. It was another woman that I'd never seen before. Seeing her face changed everything, because it broke the only explanation I'd been holding on to, and that confusion made it harder to react in a clear way. She didn't look surprised or nervous, and that made it worse because it meant she had planned for this moment and accepted it. She moved again without saying anything, and this time her actions were more controlled. We hit the wall hard enough to shake the frame, and I felt a sharp pain in my arm when it struck something. But I didn't stop moving because I knew that stopping would give her control. Before the next move, I became aware of the fire reaching the hallway and the smoke filling the room in a way that made every breath shorter and more difficult. She grabbed my arm and twisted it with enough force to make me lose my grip, and I reacted by stepping into her and pushing her off balance instead of trying to pull away. That gave me just enough space to move toward the front of the house, where the air felt slightly clearer. In the middle of that movement, I heard sirens getting closer, and the sound cut through everything else in a way that made both of us react at the same time. She turned and ran toward the back, trying to escape before anyone arrived, while I stayed near the front because I didn't trust my body to hold up if I tried to follow her. At the station, I answered as clearly as I could, even though the situation didn't make sense anymore. They asked me about her, about the messages, and about the timeline, and I explained it all the same way I'd lived it. There was a pause where the officer across from me stopped writing and looked at me in a way that made it clear something wasn't right. And that moment made it harder to stay calm because I knew the answer wouldn't fix anything. He told me she had been found weeks ago, and that she already had been confirmed dead before the messages started, which didn't match anything I had experienced. I tried to correct him at first, but he already knew the timeline, and that made it clear that the problem wasn't a mistake. The woman they arrested had her phone, her accounts, and access to her identity, and she had been using all of it to contact me and track me without raising suspicion. That meant every message I had read and every threat I had tried to handle had been coming from someone else. The messages stopped after her arrest, but she left too many questions about how long she had been watching and how she had learned before acting. I changed my number again and adjusted my routine, but those actions didn't feel like enough after everything that had already happened. What stays with me is the fact that I spent months reacting to someone I thought I knew without realizing that the real person was already gone. After Carrie Farver was murdered in 2012 by Shayna Golyar, Farver's identity was used for years to send thousands of threatening messages to Dave Krupa and others, making it appear as if she was still alive and obsessively harassing them. This deception delayed the investigation and created a false narrative that misled both victims and authorities until digital evidence and forensic analysis eventually exposed the truth.
I grew up in a very conservative household. My mother was a strict woman who hated almost everything, but what she despised most were video games. I can still remember the look of disgust on her face whenever she yelled the words, "Stop playing those cursed video games, Ellie. They'll rot your brain." This wasn't an uncommon belief among parents in the 90s, and my mother, who already distrusted most forms of entertainment, was certain that video games were created by demons to corrupt the minds of children. She always took every opportunity she had to remind me that the video games I enjoyed playing were the tools of the devil, used to poison young minds and pull them away from God. But I never listened. My uncle was a PC game collector, and he shared his love for video games with me from a very young age. The weekends I spent at his house playing the latest titles he'd picked up from his PC were the highlight of my childhood. Video games felt like an escape for me back then, as they were the only ways I could vent and forget my overbearing mother. However, my love for video games eventually led me down a very morbid path when I turned 12, as I realized that there may have been some truth to my mother's warnings. While I didn't know it at the time, one of the cursed video games I loved playing ended up rotting my brain just like my mother had said. I kept telling myself that I was just a kid, but that's no excuse for the unspeakable things I did. I never could have imagined that playing a simple game could significantly alter my brain chemistry and drastically change the trajectory of my life. It all happened after my 12th birthday party. I was spending the weekend at my Uncle Hank's place, and I was so excited to check out the new games he'd bought. I remember bolting to his monitor as soon as I arrived, and I went on to play through some of the new games in his collection, like Jazz Jackrabbit, Myst, and SimCity 2000. After sifting through his new titles, I revisited some of my favorite games as I looked up King's Quest VII and the Sonic & Knuckles collection. The hours flew by, and it wasn't long before it got dark outside. My uncle made spaghetti and garlic bread for dinner that night, which was my favorite meal at the time. We then ate some cookies and ice cream for dessert while we watched my favorite movie, Clueless. I thanked my uncle for dinner once the movie was over and for making my birthday weekend so special. But that's when he told me he had one final surprise before I went to bed. I can still remember how excited I was when my uncle gifted me his old PC with a ribbon on it. The PC had already been set up on a small desk in the corner of the room. He told me he'd gotten a new system and didn't want the old one to go to waste, so he thought it would make a perfect gift. I gave my uncle a hug and thanked him for everything again before going to bed, but I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the gift I'd just received, and I was so grateful to finally have my own PC that I could use to play video games whenever I wanted. I snuck out of my room late that night and spent a couple of hours playing King's Quest VII until I felt sleepy. Before going to bed, I took a little detour as I snuck into the basement where my uncle kept his PC game collection, and I made my way to a tall wooden cabinet with a glass door at the back of the room. My uncle had plastered a silly sticker on the locked cabinet door that read, "No Ellies allowed," as he always used to tell me I could play every game in his collection except the ones behind this glass door. My uncle was a responsible man, and he constantly made sure I was never exposed to any M-rated games that I wasn't supposed to be playing. However, it felt like the games in the large cabinet were calling out to me whenever I visited my uncle, and I was an extremely curious 12-year-old. I'd always seen where he used to hide the keys that opened the case, and even though I felt bad for breaking my uncle's trust, I opened the case and picked a game. There were several titles locked away behind the glass door. I remember seeing games like Phantasmagoria, Dark Seed 2, I Have No Mouth, and I Must Scream, and The Seventh Guest. But out of the many CD-ROMs in the cabinet, there was one particular title that stood out to me. This game was called Harvester, and I was weirdly drawn to its box. The game's cover art depicted a hooded man who had soulless eyes and was holding a sheath. The game's title, Harvester, was printed in jagged dark crimson letters across the box's cover. 3 discs were stacked neatly inside. I didn't know why, but it felt like they were speaking to me, asking me to play them. After locking the cabinet behind me, I slid disc 1 into the CD-ROM drive and pushed the tray closed. After the opening sequence played out, I took control of the game's titular character, Stephen Mason. Stephen is an 18-year-old amnesiac who wakes up with no memories in a small Texas farming town called Harvest. The only thing Stephen knows for sure is that the year is 1953. As he goes on to explore the town of Harvest, he is manipulated and forced to carry out several violent, morbid, and gruesome acts by the town's cult, the Order of the Harvest Moon. It didn't take me long to realize why my uncle was so adamant whenever he warned me never to touch the games locked behind the glass door. Harvester's full-motion video segments contained some of the most graphic and disturbing scenes I'd ever seen. I could feel my childhood innocence dying, and even though I was terrified, I couldn't stop playing the grotesque point-and-click adventure game. I played through a majority of Harvester's story until the early hours of the morning when I heard my Uncle Hank getting up from his bed. I quickly turned off the PC and returned the game's box so my uncle wouldn't notice anything. But I kept all 3 discs and hid them away in my bag. I don't know why I decided to steal the discs from my uncle's collection, as I was still petrified from playing Harvester that night. But despite my fear, there was also this little voice in the back of my head urging me to take the discs home and finish the game. I didn't say anything to my uncle when he asked why I was up so early that morning. And even though I'd been completely scared by Harvester's graphic scenes, I tried my best to act as normal as I could until the weekend was over. Despite my mother's protest, my uncle was able to convince her to allow him to set up the PC he'd gifted me on an old desk in our basement. My uncle had also gifted me a handful of age-appropriate games before assuring my mother that these titles were rated kids to adults by the ESRB and that there were no graphic elements or gore or any other mature themes. My mother reluctantly agreed to let me keep the games as she felt it was rude to decline, but she told me I could only play these games for 1 hour a day, and she often watched me like a hawk whenever I turned on the PC. I was only allowed to play the games that had been reviewed by my mother, as she always peered over my shoulder, making sure I wasn't exposed to any graphic content. But I would sneak out late at night to continue playing Harvester while she was asleep. I didn't notice until it was too late, but I had begun to disassociate whenever I put the stolen Harvester discs into the CD-ROM drive. I would completely immerse myself in the small Texas town of Harvest, and my reality slowly began to blur every time I put myself in Stephen Mason's shoes. All this eventually led to early onset psychosis as I began to hear the game's unsettling music in my head while daydreaming about committing violent acts, and it wasn't long before I started seeing him. It's really hard to explain what it was or how it happened, but I'd developed an imaginary friend called Steve. I'd had imaginary friends when I was a lot younger, but this time was different, as Steve was like a malignant tumor growing out of my neck like a conjoined twin. I've never been able to truly describe what Steve actually looked like, but he was essentially a rotting corpse holding a sheath. I couldn't make out his facial features as the skin on his face was peeling off, but he looked oddly similar to the hooded man on the Harvester's box. I can still recall the first time I began to notice him. I was terrified at first, as he had no body and his torso was growing directly out of my neck. But I eventually got used to it, as Steve had this strangely calming presence whenever he spoke. I also know this is going to sound strange, as the corpse growing out of my neck was imaginary, but I could still smell Steve's rotting flesh, and I could feel his hot breath against my ear whenever he spoke. He would whisper to me all day, urging me to cut open Luna, my neighbor's tabby cat. Luna was an orange shorthair who belonged to our elderly neighbor, Gladys. Luna had been adopted to keep Gladys company ever since her husband Richard had passed. I loved Luna, and I always brought her some food when Gladys wasn't home. But Steve urged me to cut off her paw so I could bury it in my backyard and wait for the harvest. I didn't know what this meant and tried to ignore him at first, but he was insistent. So one Saturday, I took my father's machete and lured Luna into my backyard. Following Steve's order, I mutilated the cat and took its paw. I then buried its corpse and buried its paw in a shallow hole that I would water every day. My memories from this period are all fragmented, since I would often disassociate to carry out these heinous acts. Steve's morbid requests only grew worse from there, and I found it difficult to ignore him. He would tell me to catch and decapitate a raven before burying its head in another hole. It was gruesome work, but I did what I was told. He then told me to poison the stray dog in the park and sever its tail. So I snuck out one evening, killed the dog, and took off its tail. After I'd carried out these horrific deeds, Steve would always urge me to stifle my emotions and do what needed to be done for the harvest. He would also remind me to bury the severed parts of these animals in my backyard and to water the spots to achieve an even greater harvest. I once asked him what this harvest was and why nothing was growing yet, but he urged me to be patient, as he said we would receive our yield in due time. After a few weeks, Steve told me the harvest was nigh, and we needed one final thing to reap the fruits of our labor. He told me to wait until my mother was deeply asleep and to get the kitchen knife and cut off 3 of her fingers. I told him I couldn't do it, but he said I should throw away my emotions as I had done before and take the final step toward reaching our harvest. Steve also reminded me how overbearing my mother was and how I deserved to take away the fingers she was always pointing in my face. So I agreed. I waited until the very late hours of the night before I entered my parents' room. My mother was lying next to my father, and I made sure she was sound asleep before taking out the large cleaver. With no hesitation, I took my mother's hand and brought down the sharp blade on her fingers. I was only able to completely sever her thumb, as the knife didn't go through her index and middle fingers. Nothing I could say would do justice to how I felt in that moment. And I can still remember the look of terror in my mother's eyes when she woke up screaming. It was a very distinct expression, as she was looking at her own child like I was a demon, while my father, who also had a terrified look on his face, tried to understand what was going on. It felt like an out-of-body experience as I picked up my mother's severed thumb before telling my horrified parents that I needed to do this for the harvest. After taking the knife from me, my father was able to rush my mother to the hospital, where she underwent urgent replantation, as the doctors did what they could to reattach the severed digit before it was too late. She'd lost a lot of blood, but they were able to stop the bleeding and reattach her thumb. That night changed the trajectory of my life forever, as I would spend the following years going to see more specialists, child psychologists, neurologists, and psychiatrists than I could remember. They called it a first episode psychosis. Later, someone said it was early onset schizophrenia. Another mentioned schizoaffective disorder. The specialists who examined me all spoke in cautious tones about how rare it was at my age. They also mentioned how the graphic scenes I'd seen in Harvester may have triggered something that was already there. They all assured my father that they would help me manage the voices through cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, as they tried everything they could to get rid of Steve. I was pulled from school and placed on heavy medication. My mother couldn't even look at me, as she was certain that I was possessed. My father, who was also terrified of me, was still a lot more considerate, and this put a lot of tension on my parents' marriage, as he often tried to defend me whenever my mother would suggest throwing me out of the house. It wasn't long before my mother moved out, as she didn't want to live under the same roof as me. This worsened my father's relationship with her, as even though he was horrified by what I'd done, he didn't want to abandon his only child. My uncle was also exiled from our family, as my mother blamed him for everything, and I was told I could never see him again. I also stopped playing video games, and my father monitored me very closely to avoid the same thing from happening again. My parents also tried to keep the situation from getting out, as they tried to frame my mother's injuries as an intruder's attack. But some people knew the truth, and there were a few locals who began spreading rumors of attempted matricide. So, we eventually had to move. It was a gradual process, but I eventually got better. I stopped seeing Steve, and I was able to return to a somewhat normal life. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't regret breaking my uncle's trust that night and opening that glass door. Even with all of the therapy, I still feel like I was cursed from the moment I picked up and played the video game Harvester. This curse still feels like a heavy burden on my back, because even if I can't see Steve on my neck anymore, there are days when I can still hear him whispering in my ear. His voice is faint, but he's telling me to cut off my fingers and plant them in the ground so I can finally achieve the great harvest. Digifex Interactive was a short-lived mid-1990s video game studio based in Dallas, Texas. The company was originally founded as Future Vision Inc. before being renamed Digifex Interactive in June 1996, which was the same year they released one of their most controversial titles, Harvester. The game drew backlash for its extreme violence and disturbing content. It received mixed reviews upon release, and it became a commercial failure. Harvester was also banned in Germany and other regions due to its extreme content. The controversial video game Harvester was created by Gilbert P. Austin, who wrote and directed the story. He later told the public that the idea had come to him in a flash, and he wanted the player to mull over whether they had internalized the over-the-top violence and surreal imagery of the game. Similar to many disturbing 90s point-and-click titles that were released at the time, many people believed Harvester was a cursed video game that made its players go mad. There were also several rumors that the video game was linked to an attempted matricide case that occurred during November 1996 in Monroeville, a suburb near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The attempted matricide case was never officially confirmed, as both the records and details of the supposed matricide from back then were extremely sparse. An anonymous story was later released online by a woman in 2007, claiming to be the little girl from the attempted matricide case, but no one was able to confirm if she was telling the truth, and her identity still remains a mystery. Despite being a commercial failure, Harvester went on to garner a cult following. There has also been some discourse in niche video forums about whether Harvester is actually one of the many cursed video games released in the 90s, or if the supposed curse that makes gamers run mad is just a hoax. There still hasn't been a definitive conclusion to the debate, but the general consensus is that most gamers should stay away from Harvester, as anyone who plays the game could risk losing their sanity forever.
I suddenly woke up at 4 a.m. I stayed still in bed looking at the door, trying to match the noise with something harmless. When I heard a slow step in the hallway, placed with care instead of casually, I understood that someone was moving with intention toward my room. I kept my breathing steady under the blanket, tried not to show that I was awake. The steps continued, spaced out, controlled. There was a part of the hallway floor that always creaked, and when I heard that exact sound right outside the bedroom, I understood that the person outside knew the house well enough not to avoid it. That detail made everything feel more deliberate. I thought about calling out, asking who was there, but I didn't want to hear an answer that would confirm what I was starting to suspect. Instead, I kept watching the door, waiting for something to happen so I wouldn't have to guess anymore. The handle turned slowly, and the door opened just enough to let someone enter without noise. And when the light from the hallway outlined the figure, I recognized the shape before I saw the face, and that recognition settled in immediately. There was a moment where he stood inside the room without moving, and during that moment I tried to convince myself I was wrong. He was my son. He stepped closer to the bed, and the axe in his hand became clear enough for me to understand that this was not confusion or panic, because there was no shaking and no hesitation. I tried to sit up and ask him what he was doing, but he didn't give me time. He raised the axe and brought it down on my head with full force, and the impact felt like everything inside my skull shifted at once. I fell back, trying to react, but he lifted it again and struck a second time, hitting my arm when I tried to block it, and I heard something crack. I screamed his name, again and again, trying to reach him in any way that I could, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just kept his focus steady while raising the axe again. I realized then that he was not reacting to me as his mother, but as someone he had already decided to attack. Before the next strike, there was a short pause while he adjusted his position, and I used that moment to try to move off the bed, because staying there meant I would take every hit directly. My hand slipped on the sheets, and I realized they were already wet with blood. The next blow landed on the side of my face, and my vision on one side disappeared instantly, not blurred or fading, just gone. And I understood immediately what that meant. I tried to call his name again, but my voice didn't come out clearly. I reached toward him and grabbed his sleeve, holding on as tightly as I could because I needed something to interrupt what was happening. For a second I had contact, but he pulled back sharply and my grip failed because I didn't have enough strength. He looked at me directly while raising the axe again, and there was no confusion in his face, no hesitation, just a steady focus that made everything feel controlled. I tried to move again, but my body didn't respond the way I needed it to. Before the next strike, there was another pause, and I turned my head toward the other side of the bed because I needed to see if my husband could help me. What I saw made it clear that he had already been attacked before I woke up. He was lying on his back, and the amount of blood around him made it impossible to think he was unharmed, even though his eyes were open. I tried to reach him, but my arm didn't extend far enough, and I couldn't pull myself closer. The next hit came down on my head again, and I felt my ability to focus slipping because everything was becoming harder to follow. I made sounds that didn't form words, and I realized I was losing control over my voice. He stepped away from the bed after that and moved around the room, opening drawers and picking things up, and the way he did it made everything feel planned. I tried to follow him with my remaining eye, but my vision kept shifting. There was a pause where I thought he had left, but then I heard him step closer again, and I forced myself to look at him because I needed to confirm what I already knew. When I saw his face clearly, there was no doubt left. I tried to say his name again, but it came out broken, and he didn't react in any way that matched what was happening. Instead, he looked at me with a steady expression, as if everything were already decided. He lowered the axe slightly, not as a sign of stopping, but as if he had finished this part. And then he turned and walked out of the room without saying anything. I watched him leave, and I understood that he was not staying to make sure I was dead. I stayed where I was, trying to stay conscious because I didn't know if he'd come back, and I knew I wouldn't survive another attack. After he left the room, I could still hear movement in the house, which meant he was still there, and that made it impossible to relax. I listened carefully, trying to understand what he was doing, where he was. There was a pause before the next sounds, and during that time I forced myself to move, sliding my hand across the bed until I reached the edge, and then pulling myself toward it. My body rested, but I kept going. I slid off the bed and fell onto the floor, and the impact made everything feel unstable again. But I stayed conscious. I tried to push myself up, but I didn't have enough strength, so I stayed there. I was in and out of consciousness for a moment, and when I came to, my husband was gone from the bed. I slowly crawled out the door and down to the stairs. Downstairs, my husband was standing in the kitchen, moving normally, opening cabinets and placing items on the counter as if he had just started his morning routine. I tried to call out to him, but my voice came out broken and weak, and he didn't respond. He just continued moving. I watched him more closely, and that was when I noticed the details I'd missed at first. The way his body moved slightly off. The way there was too much blood for this to be normal. And I understood that he had already been attacked before I woke up. I tried to reach him, dragging myself forward, but I couldn't get close enough. Behind me, I heard movement again, and I knew my son was coming from downstairs, still holding the axe, still moving at that same controlled pace. I turned my head slightly enough to confirm without fully looking. I tried to think of something that would stop him, anything, but my voice and body wouldn't respond the way I needed them to. Eventually, I heard the front door open and close, and the silence that followed confirmed that he had left the house. The house stayed quiet after that, and I focused on staying conscious because I knew that was the only way I had a chance to survive. My breathing was uneven, and every moment caused pain, but I kept trying to stay alert. There was a pause before anything else happened, and in that time I listened for any sign of help because I had no other option. Then I heard a car outside, followed by footsteps approaching the house. The knocking came next, and when no one answered, it became louder, followed by voices calling out. I tried to respond, but my voice didn't carry, and I couldn't make enough sound. The door opened, and I heard people entering quickly, moving through the house until they reached the bedroom, where they stopped and then moved toward me with urgency. They checked me and confirmed I was alive, and that changed the way they handled me, making them more careful, but still fast. I tried to focus on them, but my vision was unstable. They asked questions, but I couldn't answer them properly, and I could feel everything starting to fade, even though I tried to stay awake. I woke up later in the hospital, and they explained what had happened, but I already knew the most important part, because I had seen him clearly. That memory did not change. They told me my husband had actually been alive after the attack, but that he didn't make it. In 2004, Christopher Porco carried out a brutal axe attack on his parents, Peter Porco and Joan Porco, inside their home. Peter suffered multiple catastrophic blows and later died, while Joan survived despite severe head trauma that left her permanently disfigured. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case is that Peter remained alive for hours after the attack, during which he got up, followed parts of his morning routine, and even prepared items in the kitchen before collapsing.
I was not the kind of person who checked phones or tracked movements, but his behavior changed slowly. He stopped explaining where he went. He started taking calls outside, and he avoided simple conversations like they were a problem he did not want to deal with. Instead of confronting him, I decided to watch and gather details. I needed something solid that I could trust. I started writing down times and places, and I built a routine around his routine without telling anyone what I was doing. By the time I realized how far I had gone, I was already following him across the city, trying to confirm something I could no longer ignore. He always left early on Thursdays, and the pattern never changed. I needed to follow him more than once to understand what he was hiding. The first time I followed him, I stayed back and watched him enter an area that did not match anything he had ever mentioned, and I did not get close enough to see what he actually did. I told myself I needed to be more prepared next time. The second time, I arrived earlier and parked far enough away to avoid being seen, because I needed a clear view without putting myself in danger too quickly. But what I saw forced me to rethink everything in a way I was not ready for. I stayed in the car and waited, because moving too soon would have made it harder to understand what was happening, and I needed to see enough to make a decision I would not regret later. I kept my eyes on the street and stayed still inside the car, because I needed to be sure I was not missing anything important before acting. The place was too quiet, and that made every small movement easier to notice. When he appeared, I immediately saw that he was not alone, and the way he held the woman with him showed control instead of familiarity. She tried to slow down and pull back, but he tightened his grip and forced her forward in a way that made it clear she was not there by choice. Before I moved, I stayed in place for a few seconds and forced myself to accept what I had just seen, because reacting without thinking would not help anyone. The situation was already serious, and I needed to act carefully. I got out of the car and moved closer, keeping my steps steady and controlled, because I did not want to draw attention before I understood more. He dragged her to the house and forced the door open, and she stumbled inside while trying to resist, and then the door shut in a way that cut off any sound. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it, and I listened carefully because I needed to know what was happening inside before making a decision. I heard something being dragged across the floor, and the sound confirmed that this was not something I could ignore or explain away. I stayed at the door for a moment and kept listening, because entering without thinking could make things worse instead of better, and I needed to be sure I was not walking into something I could not handle. The sounds inside continued, and there were weak attempts at movement that suggested someone was still conscious. When I opened the door, I did it slowly to avoid making noise, and the smell that came from inside made it hard to stay focused, because it was strong and unpleasant in a way that suggested something had been left there for too long. I stepped inside anyway, because leaving at that point was not an option. The room looked abandoned. I moved forward carefully and checked each direction, because I expected him to return at any moment. Before going further, I stopped and listened again, because the sounds from deeper inside the house were still there, and they gave me a direction to follow. I followed the hallway and noticed a side room with a door that was not fully closed, and something about that detail made me stop before continuing. Inside, there was a table covered with papers that looked organized. I stepped inside and looked closer, and the pages described how to handle parts of a human body in a way that showed planning and repetition, and that detail forced me to understand what I was dealing with. I stayed in that room longer than I should have, because my mind needed time to process what I was seeing, and I had to decide if I was going to continue or leave. A sound from the other room forced me to move again, because it was clear someone was still alive and needed help, and that fact made hesitation feel wrong. I stepped out and moved toward the source, keeping my movements controlled. The kitchen was dim, and the woman was on the floor with her hands tied behind her back and her legs restrained, and the condition she was in showed she had been struggling for a long time. She looked at me with fear and confusion, and she tried to speak even though her voice was weak. I checked the room quickly to make sure he was not there, and when I realized he had left, I moved closer and started working on the knots that held her. The rope was tight and difficult to undo, and it required steady effort to loosen without making noise. Before I finished, I noticed the refrigerator door was not fully closed, and I opened it slightly because I needed to confirm what I already suspected. Inside, there were stored pieces of human bodies arranged in a way that showed this had been done more than once. I closed it and focused on freeing her, because staying there longer increased the risk, without helping her more. When the rope came loose, I helped her sit up and tried to get her steady enough to move. Before we moved, I stopped and listened, because I needed to be sure we were not walking into him without warning, and the silence made it hard to judge how much time we had. I supported her as we started moving, because she could not walk on her own. We reached the hallway slowly, and each step felt louder than it should, because the house carried sound in a way that made it easy to imagine it reaching the front door. When we were halfway there, we heard a car door close outside, and that confirmed he had returned. I had to decide quickly, and I pulled her into the side room with the table, because it was the closest place that offered any cover. We stayed still as he entered the house, and his footsteps moved through the rooms with a steady pace that showed he was not rushing. He stopped outside the door where we were hiding, and the handle moved slightly as if he was testing it, and that moment forced me to hold her in place to prevent any movement. The pause lasted long enough to feel deliberate, and then he moved away toward the kitchen. I used that moment to act, because waiting longer would only increase the risk, and I opened the door and moved quickly toward the exit while supporting her. We did not try to stay quiet anymore because speed mattered more. We reached the front door and got outside, and I guided her to the car while trying to keep control. When I looked back, he was standing in the doorway watching us. The police confirmed everything we found. The house contained clear evidence of what had been happening, and there was no way to explain it as anything else. The setup showed planning, and it showed that this had been going on for a long time. He was gone by the time they arrived, and the search that followed did not find him, which meant he had time to leave before anyone could stop him. I had to explain my life with him in detail, and that process made me realize how much I had ignored without understanding what it meant. The signs were there, but they did not form a clear picture until it was too late. And as for the woman, she survived. We did not stay in contact, but knowing she was alive made it easier to accept what happened. Alexander Spasivtsev was a serial killer who lured young women and girls into his apartment, where he kept them captive, tortured them, and eventually killed them. He practiced cannibalism, cooking and eating parts of their bodies while continuing to bring in new victims. He was eventually arrested after one victim managed to escape and alert authorities.
The night shift customer who would not leave. I took the night shift because I needed the money and nobody else wanted to work those hours. Midnight to 8 in the morning at a gas station on the edge of town where the highway met empty fields and the only customers were truckers passing through or people too desperate or too drunk to wait until morning. My manager told me it was easy money. Just ring up cigarettes and coffee, keep the floors clean, restock shelves when it was quiet. She said nothing ever happened during the night shift. She was wrong. It was a Tuesday in July, around 2 in the morning, when he first walked in. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up from the magazine I was pretending to read. He was tall, maybe 6 foot, wearing a dark jacket, even though it was summer and the heat outside was still thick and heavy. He didn't look at me right away. He walked slowly down the aisles, picking up items and putting them back. Not like someone shopping, but like someone killing time. I watched him on the security monitor behind the counter. Something about the way he moved made my stomach tighten. He came to the register with a pack of gum. I scanned it and told him the price. He paid in cash, exact change. And when he handed me the money, our fingers touched and his skin was cold. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and his eyes were flat and empty in a way that made me want to step back. But I was behind the counter and there was nowhere to go. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You are here alone," he said. It was not a question. I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral, trying not to show that his words had sent ice through my chest. He took his gum and left. I thought that was the end of it. I went back to my magazine, tried to focus on the words, but my hands were shaking. 10 minutes later, the bell chimed again. I looked up, and it was him. He walked the same slow path through the aisles, touching things, moving things, watching me through the space between the shelves. This time he bought a bottle of water. Same routine. Exact change. That same cold smile. "You should not be working alone," he said. "It is not safe." Then he left again. My heart was pounding. I pulled out my phone and thought about calling my manager or the police, but what would I say? A customer came in twice and said weird things. That didn't sound like enough. I told myself I was overreacting, that plenty of people come into gas stations in the middle of the night and act strange because they were tired or high or just awkward. But my gut was screaming that something was wrong. He came back a third time, 20 minutes later. This time he didn't buy anything. He just stood by the door looking at me. I pretended to be busy organizing lottery tickets behind the counter, but I could feel his eyes on me. The store was completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerators and the buzz of the fluorescent lights. After what felt like forever, he walked toward the counter. My hand moved toward the panic button under the register, the one my manager showed me on the first day of work and told me only to use in real emergencies. He leaned against the counter, too close, invading the space between us. "What time do you get off?" he asked. His voice was quiet, almost friendly, but there was something underneath it that made my skin crawl. I lied and said my coworker was coming in soon, that I was about to go home. He smiled again, that same empty smile. "No, they are not," he said. "I've been watching you. You are alone until 8. That is when I knew. This was not a weird customer. This was someone who had been planning something, someone who had watched the gas station, figured out when I was alone, came back multiple times just to make sure. My hand was on the panic button now, but I hadn't pressed it yet. I didn't want to make him angry. I didn't know what he would do if I made him angry. He reached across the counter fast, faster than I expected, and grabbed my wrist. His grip was hard, painful. His fingers were digging into my skin. "Come outside with me," he said. His voice was still quiet, but there was no friendliness left in it now. Just command. Just threat. I pulled back, tried to twist my arm free, but he was strong, and he was leaning over the counter now, half his body across it, pulling me toward him. I screamed. I didn't think about it. I just opened my mouth and screamed as loud as I could, and with my free hand I slammed down on the panic button. The alarm went off instantly, a shrieking siren that filled the store, and red lights started flashing outside above the gas pumps. He let go of my wrist and stepped back, his face twisting with anger. He looked at the door, looked at me, looked at the cameras he must have known were recording everything. He ran. He turned and bolted out the door just as I heard the sirens in the distance, police responding to the panic alarm. I stood behind the counter, shaking so hard I thought my legs would give out. My wrist throbbed where he had grabbed me. The door was still swinging from where he had shoved it open. I could see his car peeling out in the parking lot, tires screeching, headlights disappearing down the highway. The police arrived 3 minutes later. They found me sitting on the floor behind the counter, crying, unable to stop shaking. They checked the security footage. It showed everything. Him coming in multiple times. Him watching me. Him grabbing me. Him trying to drag me toward the door. The officer who took my statement said I did everything right. He said the panic button probably saved my life. He said men like that don't just grab someone and let go. They have plans. They have intentions. And those intentions are never good. They never caught him. His car had fake plates. The security footage wasn't clear enough to get a good look at his face. He became another unsolved case. Another dangerous man out there somewhere, maybe trying the same thing with someone else, working another late shift at another gas station in another town. The thought of that makes me sick. The thought that he's still out there, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to grab someone who might not have a panic button, or might not scream loud enough, or might not be lucky enough to have police close by when the alarm goes off. I quit the next day. I couldn't go back to that store, couldn't stand behind that counter where he had grabbed me, couldn't look at that door without seeing him walk through it again and again. My manager was understanding, said she'd have to quit too. She said she never should have scheduled someone alone on the night shift. But understanding did not pay my bills, and I needed another job, fast. I found work at a coffee shop that closed at 6 in the evening. No night shifts. No being alone. No empty parking lots and dark highways and men who smile with empty eyes. But even there, even during the day with coworkers around and customers lined up and sunlight streaming through the windows, I would still freeze up sometime when a tall man in a dark jacket would walk in. I'd still check the exits. I still kept my phone in my pocket with emergency services on speed dial. I still have nightmares where I feel his hand on my wrist and hear his voice telling me to come outside with him. The worst part wasn't what happened. The worst part was knowing how close I came to being a different kind of story. Not someone who fought back and survived, but someone who disappeared from a gas station in the middle of the night and was never seen again. A missing persons case with security footage as their last moments. Family members crying on the news. Searches that turned up nothing. I survived because I screamed and pressed a button, because police happened to be close enough to respond fast, because he decided running was better than staying. That is all that separated me from the others who did not make it home. If you work night shifts alone, please be careful. Trust your gut, and when someone makes you uncomfortable, don't worry about being rude or overreacting. Press the panic button. Call the police, scream, do whatever you have to stay safe. Because there are people out there who watch and wait and plan, who see someone alone and vulnerable and decide that person is their next target. I was that target once. I got lucky. Not everyone does.
It was 2:48 a.m., and I made a mistake that I don't think I can undo. I answered the call, because on the other end was me, beat, and whatever it was. It knew exactly where I was sitting. Full cinematic horror narration. 7 to 8 minutes. I don't use my real name online anymore. But for this story, you can call me Ryan, because if I told you my real name, there's a chance you might get the next call. Soft breathing. 3 months ago, I took a freelance job. $500. All I had to do was sell my voice, glitch hum. They sent me a link. The website was clean, almost empty. No logo, no company name. Just one sentence. We build voices that never die. At the time, I thought it sounded cool. Now, it feels like a warning I should have listened to. The job was simple. Record 200 sentences, different emotions, happy, angry, scared, upload the files, get paid. But the sentences weren't normal. They felt targeted. I can see you. Don't answer the phone. They're already inside. At one point, I actually stopped recording and said out loud, "What is this even for?" But I needed the money. So I finished it, uploaded everything, and within 24 hours, I got paid. No follow-up, no questions, nothing. I thought that was the end of it. Until 2 weeks later. Quiet tone, 2:48 a.m. My phone rang, unknown number. I almost ignored it. I really should have. But something told me to answer. Hello? Silence. 2 seconds. Then, Ryan? My stomach dropped. That was my voice. Not similar, not close. It was exact. Who is this? I asked. Heavy breathing through phone. On the other end, I could hear myself breathing. Then, don't hang up. Slight whisper closer. My hands started shaking. Stop messing with me. Who is this? Beat. Then it said, "They're watching you right now." I turned around instantly. Nothing. My apartment was empty, but for some reason, it didn't feel empty anymore. Click. The call ended. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone used my recordings. Maybe it was some kind of prank. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Then my phone rang again. But this time, it wasn't for me. It was my sister. Her voice was shaking. "Ryan, why did you call me last night?" My chest tightened. "I didn't." "Yes, you did," she said. You told me to check the back door." A cold feeling crept up my spine. "What happened?" I asked. She hesitated, then whispered, "It was already open." I drove to her place immediately. Checked everything. Nothing was missing. No signs of forced entry, but she was sure she locked it. And the call? It came from my number. That's when I knew. This wasn't a prank. I went back to the website. The one from the job? It was gone. Completely wiped. The link led to nothing. Even the email thread was gone. Like it never existed. I started digging. Forums. Reddit. Obscure threads. Anything about voice cloning. That's when I found it. A post buried deep online. Title: "They're using voices to map behavior." The guy claimed this wasn't just about copying voices. They were training AI to become people, to predict reactions, to simulate real conversations, to manipulate. And for that, they didn't need actors. They needed subjects. I wanted to believe it was fake until I found the folder. It was on my laptop, a folder I never created, named /RYAN_MODEL_V2/ my hands went cold. I opened it. Inside were hundreds of audio files, each labeled with timestamps. I clicked one. It was me. My voice, but I had never said those words. "Your door isn't locked." "Turn around." "Don't trust her." I felt sick. Then I saw the last file, dated tomorrow. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. Silence. 3 seconds. Footsteps. Slow. Getting closer. And then, my voice, panicked, breathing hard. I messed up. I shouldn't have taken that job. Then another voice, not mine. Close. Whispering. Too late. A loud crash. File ends. I slammed my laptop shut. That was yesterday, right now. I'm sitting in my apartment. Doors locked. Lights on. Phone in my hand. Because 5 minutes ago, I got a notification. Unknown caller. Voicemail received. I haven't listened to it yet, but the transcription already came through. It says, "Ryan, don't open the door." 2-second pause. "And the thing is, my door is locked, so tell me," very slow tone, "why," soft metallic sound cue, "did the handle," start turning sound, "just move? From the inside?"
He stalked me for the past 11 years and locked me in a bunker. inspired by his favorite TV show. You. I was 20 years old at the time, and I was studying social work. Part of my routine included a small religious group where people met twice a week to talk about their lives. And that is where I met him. He was quiet, always sitting across from me, listening more than speaking. The messages started slowly and seemed harmless at first, because they referred to things I had said during the meetings, and I answered a few times out of politeness, not realizing that responding at all would make him think he had access to me. The messages became constant, and they stopped following any normal pattern, because they arrived at all hours, and if I didn't answer, he would send another one asking where I was or what I was doing, which started to feel invasive. He asked me out several times, and I refused clearly every time. But instead of stopping, he began showing up in places where I'd never seen him before, like outside my classes or near my workplace, standing at a distance and watching without approaching. At first, I tried to explain it as coincidence, but that stopped making sense when I started seeing him too often in places that did not connect, which made it clear he was following me, even though I'd never shared my schedule. I didn't tell anyone right away because I thought I could manage it, but I started changing my routine without thinking, like taking different routes and leaving early just to avoid crossing paths with him again. The situation became impossible to ignore when I realized he was not just messaging me. He was studying me and learning my habits. One night I checked my social media and saw he had gone through years of my posts, leaving comments on old photos. You smiled more back then. You trusted people you should not trust. I blocked him immediately, but the next day I received a message from a different number, and the tone was no longer polite. The tension followed me everywhere, even in crowded places, trying to find him before he could get too close. One afternoon I got on a bus I rarely used, hoping that changing my routine would help. But halfway through the ride I saw him sitting behind me, and the way he stayed still made it clear he had been watching me the entire time. I got off earlier than planned, and he followed at the same steady pace, keeping enough distance to avoid confrontation, but staying close enough that I could hear his steps behind me. Weeks passed, and instead of stopping, he made it easier for himself by enrolling in the same academic program I was in, which meant he now had a reason to be near me without hiding it. He sat in the back of the classroom watching constantly, never speaking to me directly. Everything became undeniable when I found a tracker attached under my car, because it confirmed he had been following my exact movements without me knowing. I removed it and held it in my hand, trying to understand how long it had been there, and how many places I had gone to while he knew exactly where I was. But the next message arrived quickly, and it proved I had not changed anything. I am always near. I began carrying a small knife. I needed something that made me feel less exposed. The night everything escalated felt wrong from the beginning, because there were no messages, no signs, and no indication of his presence. I checked the locks multiple times and kept the lights on, trying to reduce the number of blind spots, and I stayed awake longer than usual because I didn't trust the quiet. The silence continued for hours, and instead of calming me down, it made me more alert, because it felt intentional, like he had decided to stop communicating for a reason. I went to the kitchen to get water, and that was when I noticed the bedroom door slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it earlier. And that detail immediately changed the way I moved. I approached slowly, without making noise, and when I pushed the door open, he was already inside, standing near the bed and watching me like he had been waiting. I tried to step back, but he moved quickly and grabbed my arm, pulling me forward and forcing me to the floor before I could reach the knife in my pocket. He pinned my wrist down with enough force to stop me from moving, and when I tried to twist away, he adjusted his position and pressed his weight down, making it impossible to get free. His hand tightened around my neck slowly, controlling my breathing instead of cutting it off immediately. And that control made it clear he had planned for this moment. My attempts to push him away became weaker as my breathing became uneven, and I couldn't change what was happening before everything went dark. The tension returned the moment I woke up. I was no longer in my apartment, and everything around me was unfamiliar. My hands and legs were tied, and I was in the back of a moving vehicle while he drove in silence, and every movement caused pain that made it difficult to stay focused. When the vehicle stopped, he carried me into a building, and the brief glimpse I saw showed concrete walls and storage shelves, which suggested it was not a place anyone would check. When I fully woke up, I was in a small enclosed room with padded walls and a mattress, and the setup made it clear this space had been prepared in advance. He sat across from me and explained his plan in a calm and structured way, describing how he intended to keep me there and how he would make people believe I had disappeared on my own. "I'll leave your phone near the lake. People will assume what happened. This is better. You don't need anyone else." He showed me photos and videos he had collected over the years, and the amount of material proved this had been planned for a long time. The tension increased when he moved closer, because he acted like this situation was normal and expected me to accept it. I changed my approach completely, because resisting physically was not possible, so I started responding calmly and telling him what he needed to hear, even though it went against my instincts. I focused on his fear of prison, which he mentioned more than once, and I used that to convince him that I would never report him if he let me go. "I won't tell anyone. I understand. I can keep this private." He hesitated, and that hesitation gave me a small chance. So I kept repeating the same idea until it became something he could accept. He eventually untied me, partially, and agreed to take me back. But before leaving, he made it clear that there were conditions. He returned me to my apartment and stood near the door, watching me before speaking again with a controlled tone. "If you lie, I will come back." Then he left. I stayed on the floor for a long time after he left, trying to understand how close I'd been to never leaving that place at all, and how easily everything could have ended differently. My body hurt and the marks were visible, but the physical damage was not what stayed with me the most. The tension did not disappear after I reported everything, because even though he was arrested quickly and the evidence was overwhelming, the awareness of how much control he had over my life remained. He claimed it was a role play, based on the TV show You, that went too far. I know it's a complete lie, but he's already paying for all the harm he caused me, and he'll keep paying for the rest of his life. Samantha Stites met Christopher Thomas through a religious group and initially saw him as just another member. Over time, his behavior escalated into a disturbing obsession that lasted more than a decade. For 11 years, he stalked her relentlessly, ultimately kidnapping her in a bunker he had constructed, reportedly inspired by the series You.
My name is David. I'm 19 years old, and until recently, I was an ordinary guy. Well, as ordinary as someone obsessed with the dark and forbidden can be. I was always attracted to the mysterious, to what others said was dangerous or shouldn't be touched. So when I heard about Polybius, I didn't think twice. Legend had it that it was a cursed game, an arcade machine that appeared out of nowhere in the 80s and disappeared just as quickly. Supposedly, those who played it experienced hallucinations, headaches, and, in some cases, even went insane. Of course, that made it perfect for me. I found a recreated version on the dark web, and upon downloading it, it felt like I had found a treasure. The night I played it was quiet at first. It was a simple game of bright colors and hypnotic patterns, but there was something different about it. After a while, I noticed that I couldn't look away. The geometric figures seemed to move beyond the screen. I lost track of time. When I finished, I had a headache, but I felt euphoric. I definitely didn't feel haunted or like the urban legends wanted me to feel for playing a simple arcade game. I went to bed thinking that perhaps it was all an exaggeration. I couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, I woke up with an excruciating headache, but I ignored it. The university waited for no one, and I was already running late. As I walked to the subway station, something caught my eye. The colors. Everything seemed brighter, as if the world was saturated. A graffiti on a wall seemed to move as I glanced at it out of the corner of my eye. I shook my head, blaming tiredness. The ride was worse. The train was crowded as usual, but people's faces looked wrong. Some had eyes that were too big, others crooked mouths that elongated when I blinked. I clung to the handrail, feeling the ground move. As I climbed down, I almost tripped. Sweat soaked my shirt. As I reached the campus, I tried to concentrate. I was sure I just needed food or coffee, but when I sat down in class, things got worse. The projector was projecting patterns similar to those in the game. I closed my eyes for a moment, but I could swear I heard a buzzing sound as if someone was talking right behind me. I looked, but no one was there. During the break, I went to the bathroom to wash my face. At that point, I wasn't even thinking about the cursed game. I thought I might have a fever or be hallucinating. When I looked in the mirror, something was wrong. My reflection wasn't following me instantly, as if there was a slight delay. I tried to move fast, and for a second, I swore my other self smiled before me. I left the bathroom almost running. In the hallway, things were still twisting. Students walked around me, but their movements were mechanical. A boy walked past me, and his face was completely black as if someone had erased his features. I closed my eyes and snapped them open. Everything was normal again. I decided I needed some air. I went out into the backyard, where there were rarely any people. But there it was, that feeling of something watching me. I turned and saw a figure across campus. Tall, thin, and completely dark. I couldn't make out features, but I felt it looking at me. When I blinked, it was gone. I tried to concentrate on my classes, but it was impossible. Every time I looked at the professor, his face seemed to deform as if it were melted. I looked at my classmates and saw that some of them had no eyes. The screaming started when I closed my eyes. No, it wasn't real. I had to remind myself of that. I decided to skip the rest of the day. I couldn't stay there. On the way back, every corner seemed to hide something. As I turned onto an empty street, I saw that figure again. Closer this time. I walked faster, trying not to look back. I felt its presence, though it made no noise. The last straw was on the subway. I sat in an empty carriage, trying to calm down. Then the lights started flickering, and when they went out completely, I saw him. He was standing in front of me. He was taller than I imagined, with claws where his hand should be, and a smile that wasn't human. I closed my eyes and prayed for the lights to come back on. When they did, the carriage was full of people, and the figure had disappeared. When I got out of the subway, I no longer knew what was real. The streets were full, but all the people seemed distorted. The voices were murmurs, a constant noise that drilled my ears. I tried to call someone, but my phone only displayed geometric patterns that moved like the game. I walked not knowing where I was going. The world seemed to twist around me. I saw the figure once again, now closer than ever. I ran, pushing people, shouting for someone to help me. No one reacted. It was as if I was trapped in a bubble. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw myself at a random man, begging him to help me. But before I could say anything coherent, I felt strong hands holding me. Cops. They threw me to the ground, telling me to calm down. I shouted at them that someone was chasing me, but they didn't listen. They just exchanged glances and said something about drugs. At the police station, they locked me in a small cell. They searched for me, but found nothing in my system. No drugs, no alcohol. One of the officers mentioned that I might be crazy. Sitting in the corner of the cell, I tried to explain to one of them what had happened, but I saw in his eyes that he didn't believe me. Hours passed, and the demon appeared again, just outside my cell. My only reaction was to laugh. I don't know why I laughed, but I laughed a lot. I couldn't stop laughing, even though my body wanted to cry. When the policemen came to pick me up, their faces were those of the figure. The next thing I remember was being in a white room, with people talking around me. I didn't understand anything anymore. Now I'm here, in this white, silent place. I think it's an asylum. We are in an asylum, aren't we? Have I gone crazy? It's because of the game, and in the end, it was all true. I wouldn't say you went crazy. Maybe that game activated something in your head that needs to be repaired. With a lot of work, you will come out, David, but I need you to concentrate. Of course, you think it's a lie. Everyone thinks it's a lie until they start to see it.
I go running at night because it fits my schedule. I work late, I get home, and I go out. That's it. No deeper reason. The road I use is always the same. It's a straight stretch of asphalt with trees on both sides. There are no houses once you get far enough in. My name is Kyle. I'm not in great shape, but I try to keep a routine. That night I did exactly what I always do. I put on my running shoes, stepped outside, and started jogging at a steady pace. The first part of the run is always normal. You still hear distant traffic, maybe a dog barking. After a few minutes, all that disappears. It's just the road and the trees. I don't use music. I prefer to hear what's around me. I was about halfway into my usual route when I heard something from the right side of the road. It wasn't loud, but it didn't match anything normal either. It sounded like something dragging across dry leaves. I slowed down and turned my head slightly, trying to locate where the sound came from. It happened again, a bit clearer this time. It wasn't fast movement, it was uneven, like something injured trying to move. I stepped off the road and looked between the trees. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust, but then I saw it. A deer lying on its side. One of its legs looked bent in a bad way, and its chest was moving fast. I didn't get too close at first. I just stood there watching it. The deer didn't try to run, which already felt off. Even injured animals usually react to people. Before I moved any closer, I stayed still for a moment, listening. The road behind me felt farther away than it should have. The trees around me looked thicker than they did when I first stepped off the pavement. I took a few steps toward it anyway. I kept moving forward slowly, watching the deer the whole time. It didn't move at all. It just stayed there, looking in my direction. Its breathing sounded heavy, like it was struggling. Before I got within a few meters, I stopped again. There was a pause where nothing happened. No wind, no insects, no other sounds. Just that animal in front of me and my own breathing. I took another step. The deer wasn't in the same position anymore. It was now behind a tree, partly hidden. I hadn't seen it move. There was no sound of it getting up or shifting its weight. It was just there now. I leaned slightly to the side to get a better look. What I saw didn't match what I had seen before. The body shape was wrong. The head was too narrow, and it was positioned higher than it should have been. It was standing. Before anything else happened, there was a moment where I didn't move and neither did it. I was trying to understand what I was looking at, and it stayed still like it was waiting for me to figure it out. It held onto the tree with one arm. The arm was long and thin, with joints that didn't look right. The skin was pale and flat in color. I couldn't see proper facial features, just a smooth surface with shallow areas where eyes might be. I stepped back without taking my eyes off it. It leaned out a bit more from the tree, showing more of its body. It didn't make any sound. It didn't rush me. It just stayed there, watching. I turned around and ran. I didn't stay on the road. I went straight into the trees without thinking. Branches hit my arms and face, but I kept moving forward. I didn't slow down to check anything behind me. The ground was uneven and full of roots. I tripped once and hit the ground hard, but I got up immediately. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me. Before I heard anything behind me, there was a stretch where the only sound was my own movement. No footsteps chasing me. No branches breaking. That made it worse because I didn't know where it was. Then I heard it. It wasn't running. It sounded like something walking at a steady pace through the trees. The direction wasn't clear, but it was close enough that I knew it was following me. Before the next moment, I slowed down without meaning to. I was trying to listen and figure out where it was coming from. My breathing was loud and uneven. The sound came from in front of me. I stopped and took a step back. That didn't make sense because I had been moving in one direction the whole time. It stepped out from behind a tree ahead of me. Same body, same posture. It tilted its head slightly, like it was observing me. I turned and ran in a different direction. I kept running, but my pace was dropping. My legs were getting heavy and my breathing was getting worse. I couldn't keep moving like that for long. Before anything else happened, everything went quiet again. No movement, no sound. It felt controlled, like the silence wasn't natural. I slowed down and crouched behind a tree, trying to stay still. I covered my mouth with my hand so I wouldn't make noise while breathing. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard something move directly behind me. I turned quickly and saw it close to me. It reached toward me with one arm. The fingers were long and thin. I got back up and ran again. Before the next moment, there was a short stretch where I thought I'd gained some distance. I didn't hear anything behind me. Then something grabbed the back of my shirt and pulled hard. The fabric stretched and then tore. I fell onto my back and hit my head against the ground. I kicked again and managed to get free. I stood up and ran without stopping. My breathing was unstable and I could feel my body starting to give out. I kept moving forward without knowing where I was going. I just needed to get away from that thing. My legs were barely keeping up. Before the last moment, everything went quiet again. No sound behind me. No movement in front of me. Then, I noticed the ground changing. There were fewer roots and the surface felt more even. I pushed forward. I saw the road ahead. I ran straight toward it and stepped onto the pavement. My footing changed suddenly and I almost slipped, but I kept moving. Behind me, I heard movement again, closer than before. I didn't turn around. A car was coming down the road. The headlights were bright enough to see clearly. I waved my arms and ran toward it. The driver stopped suddenly. I opened the door and got inside without asking. The driver kept asking what happened, but I didn't answer. I just told him to keep driving. He looked confused, but he didn't argue. I didn't look behind us. I stayed facing forward the whole time. After a few minutes, we reached an area with lights and buildings. Everything looked normal again. He dropped me off at a gas station. I sat down on the curb and tried to catch my breath. My shirt was torn, and my arms had cuts from the branches. My knee was bleeding from the fall. I never went back to that road. I stopped running at night after that. My name is Megan. I live in a small house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood with my son, Tyler. He's 12. It's just the two of us and our dog, Buddy. Nothing special about the place. One floor, narrow hallway, thin walls. You hear everything that happens inside it. Buddy came to us about a year ago. Medium-sized, brown fur, nothing remarkable. Calm most of the time. He followed Tyler everywhere at first, slept near his bed, waited outside the bathroom, sat next to him when he played games. I liked that. It made the house feel less empty. Things started shifting slowly. Tyler stopped letting Buddy into his room at night. Then he stopped petting him. Then he started avoiding him completely. I noticed, but I thought it was just a phase. Kids get weird sometimes. One evening, he told me straight up he didn't like the dog anymore. Not in a dramatic way. He said it quietly while eating. He didn't even look at me. I asked why. He shrugged and kept eating. I didn't push it too much. I told him to stop acting like a baby. Buddy hadn't done anything wrong. At least, not that I'd seen. Tyler started locking his door at night. That was new. He never did that before. When I asked, he said it helped him sleep better. I told him it was unnecessary. He insisted. A couple days later, he told me something that I didn't take seriously. He said Buddy was acting strange. Not barking, not growling. Just watching. Sitting still for long periods, looking at him without moving. I told him that dogs do that sometimes. He shook his head and said no. He said it wasn't normal. He said Buddy didn't blink much anymore. That part annoyed me more than anything. It sounded like something he made up after watching videos online. That night, I checked on Buddy myself. He was lying in the living room, calm, breathing slow. When I called his name, he stood up and came over like always. Nothing strange. I told Tyler he was overreacting. He didn't argue. He just nodded and went back to his room. That was the last time he tried to explain it to me. The day everything went wrong, I'd gone out to buy groceries. Nothing unusual. It was early evening when I got back. The street was quiet. No cars passing, no people outside. Just still. Before I even opened the door, I noticed something off. The house was silent. No TV, no footsteps, no dogs scratching at the door like usual. I stood there for a second, holding the bags, listening. I went inside and closed the door behind me. The groceries felt heavier than usual in my hands. I set them on the kitchen counter and called Tyler's name. No answer. Then I heard it. Crying. Soft at first, then louder. It came from down the hallway. I walked fast toward the sound. My chest tightened, but I didn't stop. When I reached the hallway, I saw Tyler sitting on the floor near the bathroom door. His face was wet, his hands shaking. He pointed at the bathroom. He didn't speak right away, just pointed, like he couldn't bring himself to say it. I crouched down and grabbed his shoulders, asking what happened. He looked straight at me and said there was something inside. He said it wasn't the dog anymore. Before I could react, I heard a sound from inside the bathroom. A slow movement. Something brushing against the floor. I stood up and moved toward the bathroom door. My hand hesitated before touching the handle. The crying behind me didn't stop. Tyler kept repeating that something was inside. I opened the door slowly. Inside, I saw Tyler. He was locked in the bathroom, pressed against the wall, eyes wide, breathing fast. He looked exactly like my son. Same clothes, same face, same everything. For a second, my brain refused to process it. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my ankle. I looked down and saw something clamped onto my leg. Teeth dug deep into my skin. The pressure was strong, sudden, and violent. I lost balance and dropped to the floor. The thing that bit me looked like Tyler. It had his face, but it was wrong. The skin stretched tight in some areas and loose in others. Its mouth was open wider than it should be. Teeth pressed hard into my ankle as it pulled back and shook its head. The pain shot up my leg. I tried to kick it, but it held on. Then it climbed onto me. Before it reached my face, there was a moment where everything slowed. I could hear Tyler behind me shouting. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. The thing's hands were already on my chest, pushing down. It leaned closer. Its face was still shaped like my son's, but distorted. The eyes didn't line up right. The mouth opened too far. I could see gums where they shouldn't be. Then it bit my face, hard. I screamed and twisted my body, trying to get it off. It didn't stop. It kept pressing down, teeth scraping against my cheek, trying to latch again. I grabbed its head and pushed, but it kept coming back. Then Tyler jumped in. He grabbed the thing from behind and pulled with everything he had. It resisted at first, its fingers digging into my shirt, but then it lost grip and fell to the side. I rolled away and tried to stand, but my injured foot slipped on the floor. Blood made it worse. I hit the ground again, and the thing turned fast. It crawled toward me and grabbed my ankle again. Teeth sank in deeper this time. I screamed again and kicked it with my other foot, hitting its head. It loosened its grip for a second. That was enough. Tyler grabbed my arm and pulled me up. I leaned on him, and we moved fast toward the front door. My leg barely held my weight, but I forced it. We didn't look back. We got out of the house and kept moving until we reached the street. We stayed outside for a while. I sat on the curb, holding my leg. Tyler stood next to me, shaking. Neither of us spoke at first. Then I called the police. While we waited, I kept looking at the house. The door was still open. Nothing came out. No movement. No sound. It just stood there like nothing had happened. When the police arrived, they asked questions. I tried to explain, but it sounded insane even to me. They went inside to check. Before they entered, I felt a tight knot in my chest. Not fear exactly. Something else. Like expecting something to come out again. But nothing did. They searched the entire house, every room, every corner. No sign of anything, no dog, no second child, nothing. Just blood on the bathroom floor. We didn't go back to live there. I had stitches on my ankle and face. The marks stayed. They didn't heal clean. The doctors asked questions. I gave simple answers. I didn't mention what really happened. Tyler doesn't talk about it much. When he does, he keeps it short. He says the dog changed in front of him, that it stood up differently, that its body stretched before taking his shape. Buddy was never found. No one reported a loose dog. No shelters had him. It was like he disappeared completely.
When we first pulled up to 657 Boulevard, I swear it felt like a dream. The kind of house you see in magazines. Tall white columns, a wraparound porch, and enough windows to swallow sunlight whole. My husband Daniel squeezed my hand and said, "This is it, Claire. Our forever home." We'd worked years for this. 2 kids in the back seat, boxes full of memories, and hearts swollen with the kind of hope that only comes with fresh paint and new beginnings. The neighbors waved politely as we moved in. One even brought over a pie, something that made me laugh because it felt so movie-like. But I should have known. Stories that start perfect rarely stay that way. On our second night after the kids fell asleep, I went outside to grab a package left by the door. That's when I noticed it. A plain white envelope. No stamp, no address. Just the words, "Welcome home." I thought it was a neighborly gesture at first. Maybe a note from the Homeowners Association. But the handwriting, it was old-fashioned, careful, almost obsessive. I opened it right there under the porch light. Inside was a letter. "Dearest new neighbors at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. I've been watching this house for decades now, and it's finally time for it to have young blood again. Your children fill me with excitement. Do they play in the yard yet?" The words crawled under my skin. Watching. Young blood. Daniel thought it was a prank. "Probably some bored kid," he said, tearing the letter in half before I could even process it. But even as he laughed it off, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever wrote that wasn't done watching us. By the end of our first week, we'd unpacked just enough to start feeling like we lived there. The house creaked a little too much at night, but It was old. That's what old houses do, right? Then came the second letter. It arrived on a Tuesday. Same envelope, same looping handwriting. But this time it was addressed directly to us. Mr. and Mrs. Hartley, I see you've begun to settle in. The renovations look wonderful, though I do miss the old wooden fixtures. Did you find all the rooms yet? There are some spaces that only reveal themselves to those who truly know the house. Be patient. It will show you. I remember dropping the paper. It wasn't just the words, it was how the letter mentioned our renovations. We hadn't told anyone, not the neighbors, not even our realtor. We'd only discussed it privately. Daniel's smile faded when he read it. Okay, that's not funny anymore. We called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. Could be a prank. Maybe someone from the previous owner's circle. Just keep the letters, if any more come. But they didn't stop. Every few days a new envelope appeared, sometimes tucked under the mat, sometimes inside the mailbox, always signed the same way, the Watcher. The house knows I am here. It has known me longer than it has known you. I walk by often. The upstairs window looks beautiful at night when your daughter leaves the light on. You still haven't found the secret room, have you? Each letter felt like a hand tightening around our lives. Daniel started checking the security cameras every night. I began pulling the curtains closed before the sunset. The kids, thank God, didn't know anything. But I started to wonder, was someone really watching? One night as I was tucking our son into bed, he said something that froze my blood. "Mommy," he whispered. "The man by the fence waved at me again." I wanted to ask, what man? But I already knew. That night I didn't sleep. Every creak on the floorboards, every gust of wind brushing the windows. It all sounded deliberate, like the house was listening. By morning I convinced myself my son must have imagined it. Kids do that, right? They make sense of shadows in their own way. But when Daniel left for work, I went outside just to look. Our backyard stretched to an old wooden fence, one of those weathered grayish ones that had probably been there for decades. There were muddy footprints in the grass, not ours, bigger, deeper. They led right up to the fence and stopped. I followed the line with my eyes, and that's when I noticed something carved into the wood. 3 words, small but neat. I see you. I stepped back so fast I tripped over the garden hose. The letters weren't new. The wood around them was slightly discolored, aged. Whoever wrote it did so a while ago. Maybe before we even moved in. The letters kept coming. Every 2 or 3 days, folded neatly, slipped under the front door like clockwork. No address, no name, just more riddles, more reminders that someone was watching. By now, sleep had become a luxury. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the tick of the hallway clock, twisted itself into something threatening. Daniel tried to act brave, but I saw it in his eyes too. The fear was eating at him. We weren't living anymore. We were waiting. Then one evening, while searching the attic for old documents, I noticed something strange. The floorboards near the far corner didn't match the rest. The wood was newer, paler. It looked like it had been replaced recently. I pressed down, hollow. When I pried one open, a cloud of dust rose, and beneath it, a narrow gap leading into darkness. Daniel brought a flashlight. The beam flickered across something that made my stomach twist. A room. A small hidden space, no larger than a closet. But inside were things we thought we'd lost. Our missing photographs, my son's old toy car, even the first torn-up letter back together, the one that had disappeared from our drawer, all lined up neatly on a shelf. There was also a camera, one of the same models we'd installed ourselves, except this one wasn't ours. Its little red light was still blinking. Daniel backed away, breathing hard. This doesn't make sense," he whispered. But before I could answer, something moved inside the vent. A soft scrape, then another, and a voice, low, calm. "You finally found me." We bolted for the door, tearing down the attic stairs, but by the time the police arrived, the space was empty. No camera, nor photographs, just dust, and the faint scent of cologne that wasn't Daniel's. They searched for weeks. Nothing. The detective finally said it must have been some elaborate break-in, but he couldn't explain how the letters started before we moved in. And now, every night, I hear faint footsteps above us, pacing. And sometimes, when the house goes quiet, I swear, I can still hear that voice whispering through the vents. "I see you." Epilogue. Her point of view. It's been 3 months since that night. The attic has been sealed, the locks replaced, the cameras removed, but peace, that never came. Every morning I wake up to find something slightly moved. A mug turned the wrong way, a picture frame tilted. Daniel tells me it's just paranoia, that trauma can play tricks on the mind. But sometimes when he's asleep, I hear someone walking upstairs. Slow, careful, almost as if they don't want to wake him, only me. Last night I found a new letter on the kitchen counter. Same handwriting, same folds. It only said one thing this time. "You shouldn't have closed the room." I tore it apart and threw it into the fire, but the smell of burning ink still lingers. Sharp, metallic, unforgettable. And now, as I sit here writing this, I can feel it again. That same presence behind me, watching, waiting, because sometimes evil doesn't haunt the house you live in. It haunts you. I worked the night shift at a 24-hour McDonald's near a highway exit. The place never fully stopped, but it slowed down enough to make the hours feel longer. My job was simple. Take orders, clean trays, restock supplies, and wait for the next customer. At night, we were always a small team. One person at the front, one in the kitchen, sometimes a supervisor in the back. There was always a security guard near the entrance, mostly standing still, watching people come and go. There was a guy who started showing up almost every night. He looked homeless, dirty clothes, thin body, skin pale in a way that didn't look natural. He never ordered anything, he just walked in and stood there without doing anything. Security always removed him. No resistance, no reaction. He would just turn and walk out. The strange part was that he didn't look annoyed or embarrassed. It always felt like he had already decided when he was going to leave. After a few nights, everyone started talking about him. Customers noticed him, some avoided him, others asked questions. Management told us not to get involved and to let security handle it, but that didn't stop the tension from building up. He didn't show up at the same time every night. Sometimes it was early, sometimes close to dawn. There was no pattern. He just appeared, stood there for a while, and then left when security approached him. People called the police a few times. Every time, he was gone before they arrived. No one saw him leave. He just wasn't there anymore, as if he disappeared inside the building. One night, I watched closely when they kicked him out. He walked outside slowly without looking back. A car passed in front of the building for a second, blocking my view. When it cleared, he was gone, and there was nowhere he could have gone to that fast. That night felt slower than usual. There were fewer customers, and the silence between orders made everything feel stretched out. I kept checking the entrance more than I probably should have, expecting him to show up again. Before locking the front door, I made sure it was secure. I pushed it twice, checked the handle, and confirmed it was locked properly. I didn't want any chance of him getting inside again without us noticing. Around 3:40 a.m., I was alone at the counter. The kitchen guy was in the back, and the security guard had stepped outside. That's when I heard the door open, even though I knew I had locked it. I looked immediately. The door was slightly open, moving just a little, but there was no one standing there. I didn't try to investigate further, and I grabbed the phone to call the police, telling them someone had entered the building while I kept my eyes fixed on the entrance. After the call, I moved away from the front. If someone had broken in, they would go for the registers, and I didn't want to be anywhere near that. I headed straight to the storage room, trying to put distance between me and the entrance. Before entering the storage room, I stopped at the door and listened carefully. I wanted to be sure no one was already inside, because walking into something without knowing felt worse than staying outside. Everything was quiet. No footsteps, no movement. Nothing that suggested someone was there. I opened the door slowly, stepped inside, and closed it behind me before locking it. The room was small and packed with supplies. Boxes stacked high, freezer units humming softly, and barely enough space to move comfortably. I stood still for a moment, focusing on the silence and trying to calm down. Then I heard it. A wet chewing sound, slow and repetitive, coming from somewhere inside the room. It was too close to ignore and too clear to mistake for anything else. I turned my head toward the freezer section and saw someone crouched there. The packaging of the raw patties was torn open, and he was grabbing the meat with both hands and eating it without stopping. I didn't react immediately. I just stared, trying to understand what I was looking at. His body didn't look right, like the proportions didn't match a normal person, and his skin looked pale in a way that felt wrong. Then I recognized his face. It was the same guy who kept coming in every night, but up close, it was different. His features didn't sit correctly, and his mouth opened wider than it should have while he chewed. Before doing anything else, I looked at his eyes and realized there were none. The space where they should have been was empty, and that made it impossible to tell where he was looking, even though I knew he was aware of me. I took a slow step back toward the door, trying not to make any noise. The moment my foot moved, he stopped chewing and turned his head directly toward me with a speed that didn't match a normal human reaction. I tried to move faster and reach the door, but I didn't get the chance. He was already in front of me, blocking the exit completely, without making a sound or giving me time to react. I stopped moving without meaning to. My body was locked in place while he leaned closer to my face, his jaw moving slightly with pieces of raw meat still visible between his teeth. He didn't touch me, and after a few seconds, I understood that as long as I stayed completely still, he wouldn't attack. I tried to move slowly, just enough to create space, but he followed every movement with perfect precision, staying directly in front of me and never losing track of where I was. Before anything else could happen, the door handle moved and a voice came from outside. The security guard called out and pushed the door open, stepping inside without knowing what was waiting for him. There was a brief moment where nothing happened, just enough time for him to look around and notice me standing there. Then, the creature reacted immediately, turning away from me and moving directly toward him in a fast motion. It grabbed him with both hands, one in his head and the other on his upper body, stopping him before he could even react properly. The guard tried to pull away, but his movement ended almost instantly, as if his body had shut down without a fight. I didn't stay there to watch what happened next. The moment the creature focused on him, I forced myself to move, pushed past the side, and got through the door without looking back. I ran through the kitchen and out the back exit, not stopping or slowing down, putting as much distance as possible between me and that room while the sounds behind me faded completely. I never went back to that place after that. I didn't call my manager, I didn't try to explain anything, and I didn't return for my things. I just stayed away and avoided anything related to that job. No one contacted me afterward. The police never called and the company never reached out. It was like the entire situation had been erased or never reported in the first place. A few days later, I checked online to see if anything had come up. The McDonald's was still open, operating like nothing had happened, and there were no reports about any incident or missing staff. I guessed that reporting a murder and a monster appearance wasn't good for business.